Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Paul D'Ambrosio, and I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University in Shanghai, where the Sihai Weishui Collaborative Learning Project is based. Sorry, my cat is making love to my screen right now, so things are a little difficult. I want to welcome you to our 25th lecture of the Sihai Weishui Collaborative Learning Project. Today we have Professor Mark Csikszentmihalyi from the University of California at Berkeley, who will talk about portrayals of disciples and the early development, in the development of early Confucianism. Our chair is Dr. Abigail Wang, my colleague at East China Normal University. And we have Professor Mark Krijgsman from Tsinghua University and Professor Jonnie Zhang from the Minzu University of China to discuss with Professor Csikszentmihalyi. It is becoming a tradition here at Sihai Weishui to give younger scholars a chance to be part of high-profile academic events by inviting them to take part as chairs or discussants. So if there are any young scholars in the audience who wish to participate in future events, please let me know. This event will be 90 minutes in total, ending promptly at 10:30 Beijing time. First, Professor Csikszentmihalyi will give his lecture, and then he'll have a discussion with each of the discussants in turn, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. Before getting things started and handing them over to Abigail, I want to say a few things about the Sihai Weishui Collaborative Learning Academic Forum. The Sihai Weishui Collaborative Learning Project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the less productive conventional practices sometimes found in contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we are not interested in male peacocks, in jerks, or in any form of egoism or self-promotion. We hope to curb all types of aggressive and "look at me, I'm smarter than you," or "don't I know so much," and similar attitudes sometimes found during academic exchanges. We might even go so far as to say that we hope to be a counterbalance for the negative attitude often found in blind reviews. While there is certainly a time and a place for anonymity, or at least the appearance of anonymity, communication in academia should be just as much about speaking to one another in more congenial and community-forming settings. The neologism Sihai Weishui was actually created by Robin Wang, and it's a play on Sihai Weijia, and we like to keep this idea of Sihai Weijia at the foreground of all of our events. The Sihai Weishui Collaborative Learning Project seeks to accomplish these shifts in orientation during academic exchange by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions, and responses that are open and honest. We hope to foster events where people truly learn from and with one another. So before introducing our chair, I want to once again thank everyone for coming and sharing their ideas and discussion with us today. Our chair is Dr. Abigail Wang. Abigail Wang, or Wang Xiaowei, is a postdoc researcher at the Department of Philosophy at East China Normal University. She received her PhD in sinology from the University of Leuven in Belgium, where her research focused on modern Chinese intellectual history. Her doctoral dissertation explored how 20th century Chinese intellectuals reinterpreted the early Chinese thinker Yang Zhu, examining how he was reconstructed from an ancient thinker into a pre-Qin philosopher. Currently, her research delves into 19th and 20th century Chinese intellectuals' reconstruction of Taoist thought, aiming to uncover its evolution from a traditional school of thought into a modern philosophy. We're very happy to have you here, Dr. Wang. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul. Okay. Good morning, everyone. It is my honor to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Professor Mark Csikszentmihalyi, who is a professor of UC Berkeley and a LISA Chair of International Studies, with an AB in East Asian Languages and Civilizations from Harvard and a PhD in Asian Languages from Stanford. Professor Csikszentmihalyi has established himself as a leading scholar in early Chinese thought and culture. Among his many contributions are two important works. His book, Material Virtue, Ethics and the Body in Early China, explores a set of late warring states and early Han texts that argue for a connection between virtue and the body by addressing challenges to early Chinese religious ethics through concepts like balance of qi, a notion also found in natural philosophy. This study sheds light on the neglected yet influential phase in the development of Confucian thought. Another significant contribution is Readings in Han Chinese Thought, which provides an accessible and eclectic introduction to the intellectual innovations of Han Dynasty. This connection highlights the richness and complexity of Han philosophy, showcasing its syncretism, its transformation from classical ideas, and its interaction with the religious movements of the time. With clear introductions and readable translations, this book offers readers a vivid picture of Han intellectual history. In addition to his scholarly work, Professor Csikszentmihalyi serves the editor of a journal of religious and is currently translating a fascinating set of Song Dynasty essays on the Zhang. Today, he will share his insights in a lecture titled Portrayals of the Disciples and the Development of Early Confucianism. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Mark Csikszentmihalyi as I now give him the floor.
Hey, thank you very much for that very nice introduction, Abigail. I really appreciate it. One thing I would, I think that I'm no longer editor of Journal of Chinese Religions, but now I'm editor of Early China, as Rens knows. But otherwise, I really appreciate your, clearly going to the books themselves and describing them so nicely. And I'd like to thank Paul and thank Jonnie and Rens for being willing to talk to me about this with me about this still very early project. I'm just as a way of background, I was trained by both historians and philosophers, historians like Robin Yates and Al Dean, and philosophers like David Nivison and P.J. Ivanhoe. It's kind of interesting if you go to them and say, to the philosophers and say, oh, does Mark do philosophy? They'll say, no, he does history. And if you go to the historians, they'll say, does Mark do history? They'll say, no, he does philosophy. It's kind of a funny niche to do kind of early history of philosophy and religion of China. I find that at times it can be a little bit lonely because those are the kind of two dominant approaches. But I do find actually that I keep reading things in different ways than the philosophers do, and then as the historians do, and it's kind of fun. I feel like it's a fairly interesting kind of way to be kind of between in that little area in the Venn diagram between history and philosophy. One of the things I've gotten more interested in, because I also pay a lot of attention to archaeology, is the way that disciple traditions, I think, might play a more important role in early Confucianism than people have long thought. I'm not sure this is a very controversial point, but I wanted to try to articulate it today. That is, give a kind of explanation for why I think this is worth paying attention to. And I'm just going to share my screen now so I can get started with the PowerPoint. Let's see. Here we go. View. Okay. Let's see. Now, can you see my screen now? Abigail, yeah, great. Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right. So the talk will have 4 parts. I want to look at this from 3 kind of different perspectives. The first is looking at some archaeological finds and talk about how our knowledge about early Lunyu formation kind of contributes to the sense that disciple texts are important. Then I want to look at early narratives, and I'm going to focus on the figure of Yanhui. Then I'm going to talk about the Haihunho finds and how they fill in kind of a later stage of our understanding about Yanhui's biography. And then finally, return to this initial question, what role should the disciples play in the study of early Chinese thought or philosophy? So this question of how the Analects formed, often people go back to the description by Bangu in the Hanshu, which says, the Lunyu is composed of discussions in which Confucius responded to his disciples and to others of his contemporaries, and then of his disciples' words when speaking to one another, and of the speech they heard directly from the master. So in other words, these are the records of Confucius' speech taken by his disciples or of each other's speech. At that time, each of the disciples had their own personal records, but after the master died, his disciples gathered them all together to discuss and compiled them, and so they were called his judged, evaluated, compiled speech, Lunyu. Given this, and given the other kind of historical notes we have on what happened after Kongzi's death, we might expect different disciple traditions and maybe different disciple texts, or Kongzi speaking with other interlocutors because of this story about his recorded speech. What's interesting, though, is if we look at the Han Shu Yiwenzhi, the Han bibliography that lists works in circulation or in the Imperial Library by different categories, we find 4 texts with disciple names on them. And they are not always the most important disciples. And you get the sense that maybe there weren't that many in circulation prior to the Han. Maybe these were Han works that use disciple names, and maybe the disciple texts were not that important, right? And that's where things were, I think. I mean, there are other Han texts like the Dadai Li Ji and the Kongzi Jiayu, which also preserve kind of dialogues with specific disciples or interlocutors. Like Zhengzi, for example, appears in both those texts a fair amount. But then, we began to get senses that actually there were these kind of texts. So, for example, in the Shanghai Museum collection, you have a number of texts that are specific to dialogues between Kongzi and particular disciples, but then also some others that seem to have more than one disciple. And so there's this a sense that these disciple records, in addition to being a basis for the compilation or the selection process that Bangu describes, also continue to circulate into the Warring States period. I want to note the Shanghai Museum texts were not excavated texts, but Scott Cook has recently argued that no, excuse me, I'll just leave that one alone. But to say that this is tells us that there are these dialogues, not all of which are preserved in the Lunyu, that were probably circulating in the Warring States period. Probably the most exciting recent find, and this is an excavated text, is the Warring States Wang slips. These are over 300 slips, organized into short sections beginning 孔子曰, or kind of so with a double marker, 曰, and these were excavated from 2021 or maybe over several years, ending in 2021, from Warring States Chu tombs at Wangjiazui in Hubei near Jingmen. And these sayings overlap with the Lunyu, but also contain Kongzi sayings that are found in other early collections. I think one thing that's very interesting is that on the backs of some of these slips are what appear to be chapter titles, often referring to a location or key aspects of a particular pericope, a particular Zhang. So, for example, one, according to the article by Zhao Xiaobin that I cite here on this slide, says, 据传承之下. And so, you know, there is, for example, that in Lunyu 9:17, a passage that starts saying 自在船上, right? And it's the one about the river never ceasing day or night, right? And so it seems that this is a large body of Kongzi sayings that was organized in chapters, with some kind of thematic kind of title, perhaps, because it says 传承之下, a number of these chapter titles are 之上 or 之下, indicating that there was kind of an internal organization of some kind. Scott Cook has done a kind of preliminary study of these in 2023 and has a number of really interesting conclusions that he draws. I want to mention a couple of them. He says at one point, some chapters of Kongzi Yue are basically the same as those of the Lunyu, but the names and the disciples of them are different. And this is kind of interesting, and this also keeps going into the Han. Later on, we're going to talk about Han disciple biographies, because this is where we get a lot of our information on the disciples, like the Sima Qian Jonnie Dizi Lie Chuan in the Shiji, right? So there's also this same kind of phenomenon where you'll have a very kind of a passage that's very similar to the Lunyu. It's just about a different disciples. The disciple name has changed, and I think that kind of makes you want to think, like, what were different disciples, traditions, or lineages competing in some way. Sometimes they're, are they inserting their lineage master's name in a dialogue with Kongzi in a way that is in some way promoting their lineage? This is a phenomenon that also happens in the Haihun Ho finds, and even in the Anhui University slips, where there's a text that is a Zhongni Yue text. This same kind of variant keeps happening. At the end of the article, one of his conclusions is this. He says, this implies the Kongzi Yue and the Lunyu are actually similar in kind, and both come from the same set of records of Kongzi quotations, even while their selection of specific sections differ. It seems that there was no fixed collection of Kongzi quotations at that time, and here the initial estimates for the Wangjiazui tomb are around 300 BCE, so at the end of the Warring States period, like there was in the Han Dynasty with the Analects, right? So he's arguing that these kind of freely circulating Hongzi quotations that we now see with the Anda and with the Wangjiazui finds seem to be operating in a circulating in a kind of loose way, indicating there's no canon of that they might be checked against, and the fact that these include sayings that then are found in, say, the Li Ji, right, or the Mengzi, but are not found in the Lunyu, I think is also, suggestive in a lot of ways. So I think, these finds tell us and give us some information about, these all are finds before, the bibliography of Liu Xin and Bangu that we find in the Hanshu, right? And so, he's writing, many, many centuries after Kongzi's death. And so I think it's in a way, these I think might give us a more accurate understanding of what the textual situation was. And so in recent years, scholars from Zhu Weizheng to Michael Hunter have argued versions of a thesis that say, while the content of the Lunyu predates the Han, there's little evidence that the text itself was widely circulated before the Han, right? And I think, largely speaking, these finds support a version of this, or at least this version of that set of arguments, and suggests that Bangu's view that the Lunyu was composed of different disciple traditions might also have been correct. However, it suggests that it's wrong about when that happened, right? So that the disciple text circulated alongside these collections of Kongzi sayings in the Warring States for a longer time than traditionally has been thought, before a canonical selection was isolated and elevated in the 1st century BCE. So during that time, then, I would argue this suggests that the disciples themselves and maybe the politics between their different lineages might have been kind of figures of interest, might have been played a more important and dynamic role in the development of early Confucianism prior to the Lunyu. So what do we do if we start paying attention to disciple traditions? What would that type of intellectual history involve? I think, looking at Yan Hui stories is kind of an interesting, provides an interesting template. And so in the middle part of my talk, then, what I want to do is kind of take a step back from archaeology and look at both received and discovered texts, and look at the kind of stories about Yan Hui, because I think it's possible to see the biographies of the disciples as actually playing a fairly important role in the early tradition as sites of debates about different issues within and across traditions. And so I'm going to look at 3 themes about Yan Hui: Kongzi's response to Yan Hui's early death, Yan Hui's mastery of Kongzi's program, and then stories about how, unaffected by his poverty, Yan Hui enjoys his abode. And these are 3 different themes that are very important in kind of pre-Han Yan Hui stories. Many Yan Hui mentions, though, don't really flesh out anything about Yan Hui. So I guess the first category before those 3, I want to mention kind of stories about Yan Hui as a disciple, where he just feeds questions to Kongzi. And you see this in a lot of early texts. In the Shanghai Museum text, most of the time Yan Hui is just kind of providing a question. In the Lunyu, he asks about benevolence, famously. And in Zhuangzi, too, sometimes when he appears, all he does is kind of, set up a topic, right? And of course, the topics are very different across these different texts. And it is interesting, I think, that in the Lunyu, this kind of type of Yan Hui mention is not that common. It's just under, say, 10% of the instances of Yanhui's mentions. It's actually much more common in texts like the Zhuangzi. Um, um, so many of the mentions of Yanhui are not distinctive, right? He's kind of playing a generic disciple role, and this might come out of the fact that this is, a story about Kongzi. It's the Yanhui lineage version of that story. When we talk about what is distinctive about Yanhui, one topic is Kongzi's response to Yanhui's early death. And there are many different stories about this. In the Lunyu, for example, Yanhui dies, Kongzi rails against Tian. Um, and they talk about the other disciples breaching ritual, depriving Kongzi of his opportunity to act as Yan's father. And often I think this story also plays a role in kind of Chunqiu related texts. For example, in the Chunqiu Fanlu, you get this story in Mengzi, a version of the same story as the occasion of him deciding to write the Chunqiu. I think in the Warring States and Han sources, often Yanhui is kind of the worthy who's going to accompany Kongzi when he's recognized as a sage. And then when he isn't recognized as a sage, he decides to put his way into the writing of the Chunqiu, right? So that's why we see that particular Yanhui story playing an important role in those traditions. Another set of stories is about Yanhui's incredible ability to master the program that Kongzi is promoting. So, for example, in the Analects, you get these questions about his ability to right, to study in a way. Duke I asked, which of your disciples is fond of learning? Kongzi replied, Yanhui was fond of learning. He did not take his anger out on others, nor did he ever make the same mistake twice. And then we get the segue into his allotment being brief. Ji Kangzi asked, which of your disciples is fond of learning? Kongzi said, there was Yanhui who was eager to learn, but his allotment was short. And so this is one area where these two themes are connected. We see that in other sources, though. For example, in the I Ching, Wings, we get this, the master said, Yen the younger is nearing perfection. Whenever he does something that is not good, he always realizes it. Whenever he realizes it, he never repeats it. In a way, this is probably referring back to the previous slide, where he never makes the same mistake twice, right? He never repeats it. And then this is applied to a particular I Ching divinatory statement. We see the same mastery in the Zhuangzi, right? The famous Zuo Wang story, where Yanhui progressively develops his understanding through this particular practice. Towards the end, we get Confucius says, what are you talking about? This Zuo Wang. Yanhui says, I have extricated myself from my physical body, dismissed my hearing and sight, left form and abandoned knowledge, and become the same as the great road. This is what I mean when I say sitting and forgetting. So we see similar attributes given to Yanhui that you never need to tell him twice, right? Yanhui is that type of disciple across what we would call texts in different traditions in the early period, and similar themes about his excellences. And I think that's kind of interesting. And I'm going to come back to this kind of the way that disciples kind of cross traditions a little later. The third theme, unaffected by poverty, Yanhui enjoys his abode. In the Anda Jonnie Yue slips, you get this one. Jonnie said, a scoop of cereal and a ladle of sauce. Others could not endure their anxiety, but he himself cannot contain his joy. I am not the match of Hui. Right? This is kind of interesting. We're more familiar with this in a slightly different formulation from the Analects. The master said, "Worthy indeed is hui, xianzai hui ye," right? A scoop of food, a ladle of drink, a place in the alley would cause others unbearable anxiety, but hui does not allow it to affect his enjoyment. Worthy indeed is hui, right? Uh, it's kind of interesting in the Analects, his he says Hui is worthy, whereas in the Undaslips, he says, I'm not the match of Hui. I think that's kind of interesting because in some other contexts, he says the same thing. He puts Hui above himself. For example, in the Zhuangzi, we have another story about him unaffected by poverty. He enjoys his abode, right? Again, a theme stretching across from the Analects to the Zhuangzi about Yanhui. So when Yanhui replies to Kongzi, after Kongzi kind of wealth shames him, Hui replies, "I do not wish to serve an office. Outside the city walls, I have 50 acres of farmland, enough to provide me with some gruel. Inside the walls, I have 10 acres, enough to make silk, thread, and hemp. Playing the chin is enough to entertain me, and studying my master's way is enough for my enjoyment. I do not wish to take office." Right. So this is this story. Similar stories are told about Zizi and or Yuan Xian, often identified with Zizi in early texts. And I think it's interesting. Kongzi then, says he kind of develops this idea a little bit, and he says, "I often repeated these words, but only in Hui have I now seen them manifested. It is I who gain from this," right? Qiu zhi de ye, right? And so just like in the Andao version of the Analects passage, he puts himself below Yanhui. Interesting, in the Analects, they had to kind of censor that line, right? Because it was during the period when Yanhui's connection to Kongzi was that a more clearly of a subordinate disciple. But I think that's a kind of another kind of way that the disciples, the characterizations of the disciples, are constant even while the point of the anecdotes shifts. Let's see. Oh yeah, here's Hanshu Waizhuan. Yeah, this is really kind of interesting. So now we're entering the Han period. So Yanhui says, "I would like to be able to regard poverty as wealth." And Kongzi says, "That's excellent. If you regard poverty as wealth, knowing you have enough, right? Zhizu, or Wu Yu, right? Or being without desires." And then towards the end, he says, only someone like Yanhui is perfect. The saints of antiquity themselves were no better than this. Again, we have a tradition that's slightly outside of the kind of Lunyu tradition where Yanhui is being elevated in this way. And I think this, Jitsu is a text we find in a phrase we find multiple times in the Laozi, right? It's not a it turns up in Laozi and in the chapters of the Hanfeizi that are about Laozi, and then it's picked up in the Huainanzi, right? So this language seems very much like the Yanhui and the Zhuangzi in some ways. And regarding poverty as wealth, you find that in the Huainanzi, in these passages that, are, if people said, "What kind of passage is this?" someone would say, well, that's not a Confucian passage, right? This is a passage from the Huainanzi. If you allow the mind to wander in peace and abandon the body to leisure, thereby awaiting heaven's decree, even something as grand as the world will not be sufficient to change your unitary vision. Should the sun or moon be eclipsed, this will not be sufficient to compel you to change your intentions. Thus, though lowly, it's as if you were honored. Though impoverished, it's as if you were wealthy, right? This is the same phrase that Yanhui is trying to learn from Confucius or demonstrating to Confucius, right? So Yanhui, as it turns out, if you look at him outside of the Han picture, outside of the kind of more narrow picture, if you go back to the Warring States, he actually has these very interesting dimensions. And while this we do see enjoying his abode in the Analects, we see in the Zhuangzi and then in these Han texts like Han Shu Wai Zhuan and Huainanzi, kind of traces of this view of Yanhui as someone who seems to have mastered certain methods that then later on we group as non-Confucian or as Taoist. Just as an aside, as Abigail mentioned, one of the projects I'm doing now is on reception history in the Song. And there's a Northern Song writer who has an essay, or I guess he was a lecturer at the Imperial Academy during the reign of Song Huizong. And he did these lectures on different chapters or stories in the Zhuangzi. And this is a really nice moment where he actually puts together, reweaves a bunch of these Yanhui stories, and kind of is appreciating this kind of contrast between Yanhui's approach and Kongzi's approach. And I'm just going to read the last part of this where he says, Yan, the younger a member of the Yan clan, because remember, both Yans were in the disciple community, turned his back on the dust of the world to return to the miraculous. He simply didn't trade substance for emptiness. I know that his forgetting, his Wang, is like not having yet forgotten. If you advance along this way, then not forgetting is forgetting. Kongzi traveled this way for 60 years and transformed himself 60 times. Why should he value forgetting? Anyway, I just, as someone who was trying to write essays for Confucians studying Taoism at the Imperial Academy, he makes this connection really quickly, I think. So what happens to this kind of, I think, focus on the disciple tradition and the disciples as kind of more fully fleshed out figures during the Warring States period? I think there's kind of an answer to this if we look at two sources in the Han. And one I've already mentioned, and that's the disciple biography in the Shiji. The other one is the mirror stand discovered at Haihun Ho. And this these two sources both have kind of what I would say is a kind of early stage biographies of the disciples. And the mirror stand, if you're not familiar with it, is in the tomb of Liu He, who was briefly emperor of China, and then was exiled after 27 days and went to Jiangxi. And this was discovered in 2015. And one of perhaps the most famous object from this tomb is includes portraits of Kongzi and 5 of his disciples, and then there's another disciple on another part of the mirror stand. And at the top there, you can see on the left in the white robe is Kongzi, and then on the right, facing him is Yanhui. And behind them are biographies. The Kongzi biography is very long and it overlaps quite a bit, or is maybe an abridged type version of the his biography in the Kongzi Shujia. And behind each of the disciples are short biographies, which are rather different from the Jonnie Dizi Lia Zhuan. And I've written an article on that if you want to go in more depth. I'm not concerned with this object quite as much in this lecture, but I'm kind of what I think is kind of interesting is that here you can kind of see a close-up of the picture of him. What I'm kind of interested in is the way that these biographies only draw from the Lunyu, right? They only take one particular version or casting of the disciples. Often the casting is to reflect on the glory and praise of Kongzi. So, for example, Zigong, who's often portrayed as an, in very interesting ways in early texts. He mainly just praises Kongzi to the skies in the biography in the Haiyun Ho. And if we look at the way these biographies are organized, and I've color-coded them a little bit to show some aspects of their organization. Often they'll start with the disciple's name, cognomen, age difference from Kongzi, and then start to have kind of passages, mostly parallel to Lunyu passages, often shortened. And so the dialogues that are chosen, or the statements that are chosen, generally overlap with the analects, but not with Zhuangzi or any of these other early works that I'm talking about, including the excavated texts like the Wang Jiazui, Kongzi Yue, right? There are no Wang Jiazui, Kongzi Yue passages in these biographies that aren't also in the analects, right? So the analects becomes the primary source for defining who these disciples are in these particular contexts. So in the that's the Shiji biography, and this is the Haiyun Ho mirror biography, and again, it starts with the same type of kind of biographical starting point, but it says Kongzi Dizi Yue, right? And there's kind of a debate about whether this is just kind of a self-narration where the picture is saying, I am Confucius' disciple, and I, this described, or maybe this is how we describe this Kongzi Dizi, or whether it's a textual title. I'm translating it as a textual title simply because we have received mentions of a Zhengshuan text, or Zhengshuan quoting a text called Kongzi Dizi. So I think that this might be a biographical text. And then Sima Qian and whoever did this, did these biographies, find it Haiyun Ho, choose different, and they choose very different sets of kind of analects, parallel passages, and then but anyway, so the you get, for example, Analects 12:1, the famous one about Kuji Fuli Wei Ren, right? Analects 9:11, Yanhui heaved a sigh and said, I look up at it, it rises further, or I bore into it, it grows harder, often taken to be a kind of description of Kongzi, and then analects, then a short sentence that we don't have in the analects, and then Analect 711, the master told Yanhui to work when employed, but hide oneself when cast aside. Only you and I can do this. So there's just a selection of Analect's texts, and Yanhui is here next to Kongzi, along with the other disciples, and really in a way, this is when I think the disciples are completely subordinated in a certain way to the Kongzi, to Kongzi. So I think that what we see here, to some extent, there are a lot of interesting things about these biographies, but I think in a way it shows or signals a kind of narrowing of Yanhui's story. While Yanhui had several different valences, that made him a key figure in texts of different kinds, by the end of the Han, at least, his relationship to Kongzi became dominant. And so you get these pictures of Kongzi with his disciples. Now, I mean, I've been trying to work through why this is the case. I think, I think there's an interesting question we can raise about the sudden importance of the Analects in the first century. And I think that kind of my thinking on this is informed by Michael Lowy, the historian of the Han, who noticed that in discussions of policy, Kongzi is not often raised in the first century BCE, even though we know the Analects is an incredibly important text. I like this point that Lowy made recently, in part because in an article a long time ago, I kind of made the observation that it seems that the Analect seems to be important in the education of the crown prince, or important in kind of court contexts. And then we have this tomb that's been discovered since then, where an emperor actually has a kind of mirror stand, right, where he has to reflect on himself. And then he also sees these pictures of Kongzi and his disciples. And so it seems to me that perhaps, you can ask why did Kongzi become important in the Han? It might be a different reason than Kongzi became important in the 19th century, when people like Hu Shu were looking for a kind of seminal figure to talk about Chinese philosophy, to valorize the Chinese tradition according to the standards of value of his day. In the first century BC, maybe Kongzi became important not necessarily because of his philosophy. I think that what an interesting answer that might be suggested by these early texts is that in the Han, young rulers were told in the words of the Lunyu that good government lies in the selection of ministers. Kongzi and his disciples seem to have been used in the mirror stand as a kind of didactic proxy for lessons about the wisdom of evaluating character, lessons important for the ruler. And you'll notice in the Analects, there are all these conversations that we don't pay a lot of attention to. Is this disciple Ren? I can't say this disciple is Ren. Or, comparing disciples, or disciples talking about other disciples, and evaluating their character in some way. People, today when we talk about Confucian ethics, we treat a lot of we ignore those passages, basically, right? We treat them as kind of junk RNA. We say, that's not coding the main message of the text. But what this strikes me when I look at this mirror stand and I think of the importance of the way that these disciples' character is being described, that for this ruler, maybe the evaluation of the disciples, or the correct kind of real, Confucius's judgment of their character might have been the reason that Kongzi was and the Lunyu became important during that time, right? It's not to say that's its importance or we should see its importance that way, but maybe historically that those passages might have been part of what was important about Kongzi at the time. That like the ruler who, is supposed to choose the right ministers and let them govern, right, in the Han context, or at least in the Western Han context. Kongzi was able to evaluate his disciples particularly well. And that's what all those passages are about. So the growing importance of the Lunyu in the Western Han meant that Lunyu accounts of the disciples became very central. And the disciples then became important because they were Kongzi's disciples and because he was able to tell what they were all about very quickly. However, if we want to go before the Lunyu becomes the canonical text in the 1st century BCE, if we want to understand how the tradition developed over the centuries between Kongzi's death, perhaps in 479 BCE, and the Shiji in 100 BCE, right? That's over 3 centuries. If we want to understand those 3 centuries of the tradition, the potential for reconstructing the disciple traditions, aided by the important archaeological work being done in the People's Republic of China today, we can maybe these disciple traditions can help in filling in these missing centuries of early Confucianism prior to the Han. Okay, so that's my argument about why we should pay attention to portrayals of the disciples if we want to map out the development of early Confucianism. Thank you for listening to me. I've tried to keep this towards the short end of period of the lectures because I have such good commentators and because I like to have discussions more than I like lecturing. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Abigail, and I'm curious what people say about what I've said today. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor, for such an engaging and thoughtful lecture. Your exploration of the portrayals of disciples and their role in the development of early Confucianism has opened up new ways of thinking about the historical and philosophical dynamics of this tradition. The depth of your analysis and your ability to connect textual traditions with broader historical narratives are truly impressive. Now let's to enrich our understanding of the lecture, we are fortunate to have 2 distinguished commentators with us. Our first commentator today is Professor Rens, Krijgsman, an associate professor and Town Foundation Scholar at the Research and Conservation Center for Unearthed Texts, Tsinghua University. Krijgsman earned his Dr. DPhil from the University of Oxford and previously taught at Wuhan University Center for the Study of Bamboo and Silk Manuscripts. His expertise lies in the material and textual qualities of unearthed manuscripts from the Warring States to the early empires, with a focus on their social history and cross-cultural manuscript studies. Professor Krijgsman is deeply involved in the field, serving as secretary for the European Association for the Study of Chinese Manuscripts and holding editorial roles for journals and book series such as Bamboo and Silk and the Tsinghua University Warring States Bamboo Manuscripts, Studies and Translations. His recent works include early Chinese manuscripts, collections, sayings, memory, verse, and knowledge, and an upcoming study and translation of the Warring States narrative accounts. Let's turn it over to Professor Krijgsman for his commentary.
So thanks, Abigail. That was a wonderful introduction, and thanks, Paul, for organizing this. But thanks mostly to Mark for this wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it, and I was constantly thinking about how what you're saying links up to so many fascinating questions, and I really think you've hit on something very significant, right? That We're used to put the focus on the lead character, right? On Kongzi, and he's our action hero. But when you look around all the dynamics around this figure, you're totally right. This is what colors in so many of these dynamics, right? And all these shades of differences as sides of debates within and across traditions, I should say. So I really like that. I'm not sure if this is what I'm gonna give back to you now is our questions or more like angles that you could compare and contrast what you're saying with, right? Like to throw even more light on both the unique characteristics of what we're seeing within this tradition, but also maybe there are some commonalities that we can observe. So there's two elements to this. On the one hand, I'm struck, as I think is common perhaps with this, but when you compare these disciple traditions as they regard Kongzi, and then you put that, say, next to somebody like Jesus and his disciples, right? You throw up all these very interesting contrasts that are possible. So because I know there's been a lot of research in that area, I was wondering to what extent you are considering engaging with that in sort of a comparative angle, right? I think from our study of early China, there's a lot of aspects that we can contribute to these larger discussions that have previously been dominated by things like biblical scholarship or classics, for example, right? And I think what you talked about today is one of those examples that could really provide a different type of model of how to think about what disciples are and how they're used by tradition, right? And what roles they function, because it's obvious it's very different society. And one thing that stood out to me is you talked a lot about Yunqi and his special role amongst these disciples, right? And a word that kept coming up was like murdered innocence for me, right? Like it's almost as if he was too good to outlive the master, right? Like he had to die to sort of prove the point. He had to die early in order to be even saintlier, and that is a thing that happens to almost all of Jesus' disciples, right? They're all martyred. They are martyred after Jesus, right? But they're all martyred just to prove that point. Like, hey, look how sagely and holy the way was, and that's why they were martyred. But they pressed on regardless, right? So I'm wondering if there are parallels and also contrasts that you can think of within that framework. And then you bring up this very interesting dynamic of these disciples serving as models, right? And the way Kongzi engages with them also as if they're just sort of playing out that disciple dynamic, right? Like, how do you deal with your ministers? And this opens up a whole range. You framing that opens up a whole range of other potential comparatives within tradition, right? Like if we look at the Warring States materials, recently I've been working a bit on some of these manuscripts from the Tsinghua manuscripts that have these Chunqiu rulers, and they are engaging with their ministers, right? And basically they're being chided by their ministers. So it's a very different way that role is conceived, right? The ministers are clearly, they have a larger voice. They're a lot closer to, say, how Confucius would be. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about how that dynamic in general has changed, and maybe does this somehow relate to the way these disciples were reconfigured within the tradition, right? Does that speak of this broader dynamic going from warring states' views on how a ruler and a minister engage in reality and in an idealized setting, right? And how that model is gradually shifting towards the early empires. So I'm just gonna mention these. There's lots of things I was thinking of because this is really a fruitful talk. I'm very thankful for everything you shared with us, and I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation. Thanks.
And now, Professor, you can respond.
Okay, this is the point where I really appreciate this, how constructive your comments are, and this gives me a lot to think about. So I just, first of all, thank you, Rens. That was really some great comments. I think that with regard to the comparative aspect, I think that I do a lot in religious studies, and I think that comparative religion is a very interesting kind of historically it's always played a really interesting role because our first views of China were through the missionary lens, right, here in the West, and there's a kind of tendency to do things like, read the Analects and say, oh, look, there's the golden rule, and missionaries did that quite a bit, and I and I happen to think that it's, that they like, for example, that particular comparison is not a very very apt one in a lot of ways. I think that that if you try to understand what those passages mean, the Alex is so terse, it could mean the golden rule, but I think if we look at longer passages that have similar formulations, they're really not talking about the golden rule per se. So I think that I'm a little wary about that because I feel it often comes out of a kind of impulse to see things as being the same. And but I appreciate what you say, and I think that it would make sense that masters and disciples would work similarly across traditions, right? I mean, that's just almost a human kind of a human phenomenon rather than a culturally bounded one, right? And as you say, that the idea that the different disciples wrote down their versions of Kongzi's sayings, or his story and his sayings. I mean, that's what the synoptic gospels are, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all have lives of Jesus at the beginning of the so-called New Testament, right? And so that's an incredibly, a similar kind of aspect to it. And then if you look at the way those are organized slightly differently, it also reminds me a little bit. And at the beginning of an article I wrote on it was in the Kern and Hunter volume. Uh, I do talk about how the Synoptic Gospels also sometimes are organized in a kind of topical subject matter way, and other times are organized kind of more in a bibliographic chronological way, also reflecting the way that Kongzi saying texts can be organized rather differently. Some are by the conversation partner, and others are subject or topically oriented. And so I think, actually I'd be much more interested, instead of talking about parallels between Kongzi and his disciples, at looking at the way that multiple accounts or disciple schools might be working in the Bible and in the early Chinese textual records. So, but that's a great, I mean, I think that's very fruitful and made me think about that synoptic gospel parallel in a way I hadn't before. I liked what you said also about Yanhui being too good to live, and being martyred in a certain way. could also be he was, going off the reservation too much, spending all that time sitting and forgetting, and the other disciples thought he was, well, and they could have been jealous of him too. I mean, Confucius really is a kind of, he's, you say, there's a saying when you're parenting, all children are my favorite, right? You don't want to say, Bobby is my favorite. Even if Bobby is your favorite, you don't want to say Bobby is your favorite. But Confucius is pretty clear, right? I mean, Yanhui. And so I like the idea that maybe there's a story that the other disciples got together and bumped him off. But I think there's something to that, and it is interesting though that he suffers that fate. It is also interesting how these biographies in the Han are really interested in how much younger each disciple is than Confucius. It's like that age difference is much more important than any absolute dating, right? And I think I'm curious about why that is too. The last point, disciples as models, and how one deals with ministers in, from, say, the Warring States to the Han. And that's also, I mean, that really makes me want to just sit down and start thinking about this and rereading things. My initial, you mentioned the Tsinghua slips. I'm thinking, if your minister is a cook and who's feeding you broth of animals or people or whatever, that kind of story just seems to me to have so many fantastic elements, and clearly be whereas by the Han, minister-ruler relationships are at the heart of the way this huge organization, works. And it seems a lot more kind of, in some ways, pedestrian than the Tsinghua stories, right? But the actual, in a way, they're illustrations of the method that the ruler is supposed to use, in terms of evaluating the disciples. I've even wondered if the inclusion of pictures in both the Hyunho mirror stand and in certain disciples' texts from the Eastern Han that we see described in the Hanshu bibliography or other sources, the pictures of the disciples become very important. And I wonder if that's connected to character evaluation in some way, since we know that physiognomy is a huge part of judging things, not just people, but horses and swords in early China. But that's really an interesting thing. I think that would be a fascinating way to take this. So thank you very much.
Perfect timing of response. Our second commentator is Professor Yunqi Zhang, an assistant professor at both the School of the Chinese Nation Studies and School of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Minzu University of China. Dr. Zhang recently completed her PhD at Peking University, focusing on Neo-Taoism and Neo-Confucian philosophy. Her current research explores the interplay between Xuanxue, Buddhist and Taoist philosophy and commentaries in the Zhuangzi. Before we welcome Dr. Zhang to share her perspective on our today's lecture, I would like to remind you that the commentator has less than 5 minutes to give the comments. And now I give the floor to Dr. Zhang.
Thank you, Abigail, and thank you, Professor Csikszentmihalyi, for this amazing lecture. It's really an honor for me to participate in this discussion, although I'm not so systematically trained in early exegetic text or early intellectual history. Maybe I should share some of my learnings from your lecture, and maybe I will propose several minor questions. So it's really amazing to like convey so much in this short lecture within an hour. I think what I learned from your lecture is first that how at the very beginning, how Confucian dialogues were like a multiple traditions centering different disciples, but eventually came together, probably through like a recomposing or reconstruction of the Han scholars, and making Confucians the more like identical center of the tradition. I'm not sure if this is the right reiteration of what you're saying. So, and what Professor Csikszentmihalyi seems to like make the point at the ending of the lecture is that there's a central goal or central principle of this like recompose or reconstruct. There's a motive for this the dialogues involving multiple disciple traditions to become one, which is like as in the education of future rulers, as in the education of the crown prince, we have this usage of the analects or the Confucian dialogues to show how a sagely Confucius can educate or make use of the different talents of each disciples, how to how to achieve a certain oneness amongst multiple disciples. I'm not sure if I'm understanding this right, but this really reminds me of how Ge Zhaoguang talks about how Han scholarship always aims at gaining a certain unity of multiple traditions of knowledge, gaining a integrated system of knowledge, which kind of exemplifies the Sheng Dao, the Wang Dao, which like integrates all the Baijia knowledges into one. So, and through the Han recomposing and reconstruction, the Analects become what we now see, especially in the later dynasties. Analects is more seen as a identical text conveying thoughts of the sagely Kongzi and what he taught his students. But it was originally this multiple traditions or like multiplicity of different characters, different virtues, but then combined into one in the Han Dynasty. I have like maybe two small questions. One is there, could you illustrate more on maybe the like in terms of central creed or Yili, how the Han Dynasty scholars or how in the process of these multiple traditions becoming one, is there a like single Yili, single sense of central creed that kind of make this transition, like from the multiplicity to this unity? Is there like they have a motive, or they have a in terms of thought, what's the central creed in behind these? And also another small question is you cited Zhuangzi as source of like Confucian disciple texts multiple times. Meanwhile, a lot of scholars think that stories of Confucius and Yanhui in the Zhuangzi are probably creative literature writings, but obviously they also have certain historical value in terms of how these disciples interact with Kongzi, how these disciples, they have their certain unique characters. Could you illustrate more on how you see the values of these stories in the Zhuangzi? Does that show probably and what relation of the Zhuangzi text and the Confucian tradition does these materials show? I mean, does that mean part of the chapters or part of the learnings of the whole Zhuangzi they might have a Confucian origin. I mean, because maybe usually the disciple stories, the characters, the figures are a part of the multiple lineages of the Confucian school, the Confucian studies, and through how these stories are integrated into the Zhuangzi, does that means some kind of relation between the Zhuangzi and the Confucian learning? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zhang, for your interesting questions. And Professor Csikszentmihalyi, you have maybe less than 5 minutes to respond.
Okay. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the comments, and I appreciate you pushing me a little bit on that last point, especially because I have an answer for you. But first of all, I think you did a great summary. I think that the idea is that they are educating the crown prince, among other things, to be a good judge of character, and that's what Confucius was, and that's why Kongzi is so important in that process. The ministers are doing this, right, because they want the ruler to be the selector of ministers and then the ministers to do the work, right? They don't want the emperor involved. You mentioned Guozhou Guang, and I really do agree that the Han was, if you were to describe it, it would be a kind of a synthetic period, right? Because suddenly you have all these diverse regional cultures and methods, and you need to unite them. And so if you're talking about a central creed, maybe the central creed is Tao, right? Where Tao is a kind of epistemic tool to create unity in the multiplicity, right? In that way. And I think that, a way to look at the early tradition is what if it kind of challenges us then to imagine early Confucianism as multiple disciple traditions that then are unified by the elevation of the Lunyu. Robert Eno is actually a scholar in the US who's done a lot of really interesting work on the kind of competition between different disciple traditions in the late Warring States period. And your last point I thought was very, very good too, about Yanhui being kind of the Yanhui stories being creative literature. And I think I'm not going to deny that I feel that that the Zhuangzi's conversation partner in some way is these Confucian texts. I mean, I'm not going to go as far as Hanyu and say that Zhuangzi was a former Confucian or something like that. But definitely there's this give and take. But I'm not sure I would say that I would discount them then in terms of, I don't know, I wouldn't guess either of them would necessarily be historically reliable. I mean, they're all part of a kind of didactic but I guess my response would be, look at the Han Shuai Zhuan, right? This is a text written around the Shijing, so we would call that, it's concerned with Ru values quite a bit, and yet it's preserving this picture of Yanhui and the vocabulary of Yanhui as doing this kind of Zhuangzian kind of thing, right? And I also showed a couple of characteristics of Yanhui that are common across Zhuangzi to the Analects. And so I think that's also an argument that it's at least preserving something in other early texts about Yanhui. And finally, I would point to the fact that the archaeological texts are showing show a passage that where Kongzi is saying Yanhui is my teacher, he's better than me, right? And that same passage by the Analects has now been edited down to saying, 现在回也, right? It's being so in a way, the Zhuangzi is preserving this what seems to be maybe a pre-Han kind of dimension of the Enzi Kongzi dialogues. And so while I have no evidence that, the Yanhui of the Zhuangzi should be taken seriously in a kind of historical way, I think there are some suggestions that, we could take it at least as seriously in some ways, unless what we're trying to do is create a kind of Yanhui that is a Confucian Yanhui, which is what I think was done in the Han, right? But as for who Yanhui really was, or what portrayal of Yanhui is earliest, I'm not sure we really have enough data to choose one or the other, honestly. But thank you very much for those comments. I really appreciate them.
Thank you, Professor. Great. Before I open the floor to the audience and start the Q&A session about the relationship between Kongzi and his disciples was utilized by the educator of the rulers, and how this may influence how the ruler interact with ministers and how he chose ministers. And that particular point led you to a reflection on the 19th century intellectuals such as Hu Shi, who would who would reconstruct Kongzi to establish this early thinker as an important figure in Chinese philosophy. Could you please say a little bit more in the 20th, late 19th and early 20th century? Because I have this, I am under the impression that maybe what you're saying is this text, not only that they were used in the 20th century as texts, the reinterpretation of this text in the 20th century might have been heavily influenced by the political environment, but also when these texts were composed or when they were edited, they were already under the influence of a sort of political environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so and I think I think you've really kind of honed in on my kind of view of this, that already by the late Wang States period, there have been a lot of kind of churn within the Confucian tradition. You probably have Kongzi's words mixed in with the Yanhui school of Kongzi's words, with the Zhang school, the Zisha. Zisha's more interested in poetry, Zheng's more interested in filial piety. You have this kind of a lot of resources that you can draw from. And at different times in history, different sets of different selections are made to portray Kongzi in different ways. So my argument is that in the Western Han, at least in a court context, and it's different in other contexts, but in a court context, the ruler is told to follow Kongzi's example because Kongzi was such a good evaluator of a talent. But then when you get to the late imperial period or the end of the imperial period, Kang Youwei wants to create Confucius as a reformer, right? Because he's interested in, preserving, kind of creating a quasi religion to compete with the kind of, the Christian religions of the imperial powers, and Hu Shi is interested in developing the picture of Kongzi as a philosopher. And so, at each period in Chinese history, and I'm not the first person to say this in any way, but you really can see that the fact that there's so many resources you can choose from. So Kang Xiaowei is interested particularly in the Gongyang kind of tradition. Hu Shi puts the emphasis back on the analects. And because I'm an historian who's interested in the early period, I'm just fascinated by these new archaeological finds that allow us to imagine different early Kongzes from the one that we've been paying particular attention to in the 20th century, which is primarily analects based in that way.
Thank you very much. Well, now I should open the floor to for the audience, but in the chat we already have one question. Maybe I should read this question first. It's from James Selman. Let's remind ourselves that Guo Xiang, the editor of the Zhuangzi, was a Confucian. Are the Kongzi stories in the Zhuangzi examples of Guo's trace of the master?
Yeah, that's interesting. So hello, James. I'm not sure we've ever met, but it is a very timely question, and I know since you're the scholar of timeliness, I appreciate that. Let's see. Yeah, well, Guo Xiang, and if you look at a lot of the scholarship on Guo Xiang, he's very interested in kind of character kind of questions. I'm trying to remember the scholar who's written a lot about that. Because in the, you have during that period a lot of attention to character assessment, and when Guo Xiang is writing about or commenting on Zhuangzi, he's interested in that same thing. And I think, the continuities between the 1st century BCE and Guo Xiang's time, it's not surprising that in an imperial system where that character evaluation becomes very important, as because it's involved with promotion to kind of an official post. But when I look at your question again, I realize I'm riffing on Guo Xiang, but you're asking a slightly different question. Are the Kongzi stories and the Zhuangzi examples of Guo's traces of the master? Oh, I see. So I'm not sure if you're asking like to us or to Guo Xiang in some sense, but yeah, in a way I like that. Guo Xiang uses the term traces, as Brooks Zaporin points out quite a bit, right? Jonnie, that traces is the central concept for Guo Xiang, and in a way, yeah, that's what we're all trying to do, is to track back, and instead of no, I like that. I appreciate that question quite a bit, James. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it seems that we should end this session because now our time is up. Okay, as we come to the end of this fascinating session, I'd like to extend my deepest gratitude to Professor Csikszentmihalyi for delivering such an insightful and intellectually stimulating lecture. Your exploration of the portrayals of disciples and their impact on development of early Confucianism has given us a lot to reflect on. I also want to thank our commentator, Dr. Krijgsman and Dr. Zhang, for their thoughtful and enriching perspectives. Your comments have added valuable depth to our discussion and brought new dimensions to the idea of the presented today. Lastly, thank you to our audience for your attention and engagement. I hope today's session inspires further exploration and dialogues on these important topics. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.